Ms. Lento, please proceed.
Okay. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Corey Travis Michelow loved the solar system, and this case is about Corey. This case is about punishment. On March 20th of 2021, Corey's mother brought Corey home 2 hours late. Corey was punished. He was put on a treadmill. We have a video of this treadmill. On April 2nd of 2021, Corey was brought home 14 hours late. Corey was punished. The person who loved him the most inflicted blunt force trauma, which is child abuse. His heart was lacerated. His liver was lacerated. This case is about punishment. I first want to go over some of the arguments that the defense made, specifically the defense attorney, in his closing argument. The defense attorney argues that Corey died of natural causes. And he's arguing that Brianna's conduct is a ruse to get custody. This argument makes no sense, ladies and gentlemen, right? This was not a ruse that somehow Brianna is making up bruising and taking Corey to the doctor regarding bruising. There's a video that you have seen where you could see the defendant abusing Corey. The defense attorney talks a lot about endangering. Well, you as the jurors get to decide whether what's seen on that video constitutes endangering. And I'm going to talk about this more later, but in terms of the endangering statute and what the state has to prove, the state is not required to even prove physical injury regarding the endangering charge. However, there is evidence of injury to Corey's head, and you hear that from Dr. Andrew when he talks about the contusions that are found underneath the scalp. Defense attorney speaks about substance abuse. Corey did not die because he ingested drugs. There's no evidence of that. So what is the purpose then regarding talking about this? The purpose is to lead you on a path away from the facts of the case and the evidence which is in this case. And the text messages in which the defense counsel is referring to, at the end of it, Brianna talks about the defendant and what's going on with him. This is what is stressing her out. The GoFundMe, right? There's testimony about this. This went for funeral and burial costs for donations. This 33-second video. In the video, you can hear Brianna sighing in response because she thinks that the defendant is not at home because when she gets there, his car isn't there. Brianna lives in Englishtown, not Jamesburg. When Corey gets off the treadmill, he staggers. And Dr. Deacon had more things available to her than Brianna's words. And again, this goes back to the ruse, right? How could this be a ruse? What happened on the treadmill happened before this. Corey was a patient before with this doctor, and there was also testimony that she had spoken with DCPMP. Kim Peace's letter was from the beginning of the school year. The Key West vacation, which is referred to, there was nothing stopping the defendant from going to Key West. And again, we're going to talk about what is required for murder, and there is no premeditation required. So what does that make a difference? The garbage, right, State's not arguing that he was trying to cover up things. It basically tells you a timeline of what happened that day, and that's why the garbage was delayered. Nurse Doyle testified that he did not realize the seriousness of Corey's condition because of how the defendant presented it. The critique of the medical staff at Southern Ocean Medical Center had nothing to do with Corey's death. So why are we commenting on it? The CPR was started and stopped. It was not continuous CPR for 49 minutes. Carnival, the nurse, testified about this, right? Because what happened was Corey had lost his pulse, right? And then he regained it because they were taking him to the CT scan. So it was not continuous 49 minutes of CPR. The blunt force trauma injury, right? A strike or a hit, that's blunt force trauma, may have not left a visible bruise, right? This is what Dr. Andrew was talking about, right? It may not have left a visible bruise, or the bruise may have not come out, or it may have been bruises that were underneath the surface, right? So those are all of the different things as to why what would be there and what wouldn't. So I believe defense counsel said in his summation that the state was saying that all the bruising was specifically underneath. And that was a testimony about that. Sergeant Scuddy attended the autopsy and spoke about it. And Dr. Agasa never determined that the death was natural. This treadmill video, which was recovered by the prosecutor's office, speaks for itself. Everything that you need and want to know is captured on this video. The judge at the end of the case is going to talk to you about the law and is going to charge you about the elements, right? The judge is going to tell you that you can use this video as a specific kind of evidence, right? You can use this video to show or to consider what the defendant's motive was, what his intent was, that what happened on April 2nd wasn't an accident or mistake, right? So that's how these two things correlate. The state is not saying that Corey died as a result of the treadmill. What we're saying is what happened in the treadmill shows the defendant's motive and his intent to what he did on April 2nd. And the judge is going to instruct you as to that type of evidence. The treadmill, right? March 20th, 2021. We know that on that particular day that the defendant is angry. He is angry at Brianna and he is angry at the situation. How do we know this? Because he says so. We have the text messages. We know that his purpose and his intent that day was to punish Corey. You can see the text messages, right, of what he specifically says. And if you look at the time, that is right while this is happening with the treadmill. You're almost 2 hours late, what the bleep, and then it continues. And the last text message, this is beyond pissing me off. My entire plans for today are ruined. We know that it was his intent to punish. If you look to the treadmill footage or the videos, there was a few of them. The defendant tells Brianna, I'm at the clubhouse gym. Just drop him off here. He's not at the clubhouse gym, right? This is a clip from the first video, and you can see in there that the defendant is actually walking to the clubhouse gym, right? So what does this show us? It tells us that the defendant wasn't merely working out at the gym and trying to have a nice workout with his son. It shows us that it was his specific intent to punish him that day. Bring him right to the gym. When, it's a clip from the other video, when they start entering the gym area, you can see that the defendant doesn't greet Corey, he doesn't look at Corey, he doesn't talk to Corey. He's going to punish him. He sends Corey straight to the treadmill, right? This is not, I'm working out, let's get together, let's get in shape, let's run on this treadmill. Corey knows how to turn on the treadmill by himself. What does that say? Brianna, Corey's mother, is 2 hours late and dropping him off. In the second video of the treadmill, you can see this, and this is a clip. What is the defendant holding up? He's holding up the number 2. And why? Because he's making sure that Corey knows why this is happening. You're being punished 2 hours late. That's why there's a number 2. You can see that during this video, the defendant is upset, he is angry, he is pacing, he is clenching his fists, as you can see there. Corey's on the treadmill, he's clenching his fist. The defendant is sweating, not because of a workout, because he is enraged about the situation, and he's taking this out on Corey. The treadmill, ladies and gentlemen, is the defendant's mechanism for abuse. And you can see this. He invades Corey's space, and he goes right up to him to intimidate him. Corey knows how to operate the treadmill. He does not need someone to operate it. Corey runs on this treadmill for 10 minutes before the defendant then increases the speed, and then he also increases the incline as well. You can see here in this video, or a clip of the video I should say, that the incline is increased on the treadmill, not just the speed. If you look at one picture, you can see the front is down, and the second picture, it's raised. Corey falls 6 times on that treadmill. Right before his first fall, the defendant knows it's coming. He actually stands behind the treadmill, his hands on his hips, waiting for Corey to fall. And why? Because he's increased the speed and the incline. Corey falls off the treadmill the first time. Corey is airborne. The defendant lets Corey fall. The defendant actually makes room for him to fall. The defendant doesn't stop. He doesn't check on Corey. He doesn't do any of these things. And you can see when this is stopped of the impact of what is happening to Corey right there. The defendant forces Corey back on a moving treadmill. And the defendant then picks up Corey by the front of his shirt, and Corey's feet are now dangling. And you can see that right there. And again, as this continues, he's picking him up by the top of his shoulders and shirt. And you can see Corey's legs that he does not want to get back on that treadmill. He treats him like a rag doll, right? He's picking him up, his legs are swinging. And if you look at the defendant's face in this clip, he's like smiling and smirking because he's abusing him. This is what the defendant does while he's trying to put Corey on a moving treadmill. You can see where his mouth is. The defendant bites Corey's head. You can see here that the defendant's mouth is wide open And then you could actually see how he continues to push down with the bite on Corey's head, and Corey's legs now are starting to go get pushed down as compared to the first picture because they can't keep up. What kind of father would do this to their son? We know, and the injury here, because of this bite, is talked about. Dr. Andrew talks about the fact that there are contusions on the top of Corey's head, but underneath the scalp. After getting Corey back on the moving treadmill, the state submits that the defendant then continues to yell at him. Corey falls off the treadmill a second time. Corey looks up at the defendant after he falls the second time, and the defendant does not stop. Corey falls off the treadmill a third time now. You can see here that Corey is completely flat. He's on his face on the treadmill while the defendant stands by with his hand on his hip. Corey looks up at the defendant, and the defendant still, at this point, does not stop the treadmill. Corey falls off the treadmill for the fourth time. Corey is looking up at the defendant, his father, and his father stares back at him. Still not done yet. Corey falls off the treadmill fifth time. His father has no regard for him whatsoever. Corey falls off the treadmill sixth time. Corey tries to balance on the side of the treadmill while it's moving. And you can actually see in this picture that Corey is more afraid of his father than getting back onto that machine. After 6 falls and biting Corey on the head, the state submits that the defendant is still yelling at Corey. After 6 falls on the moving treadmill, the defendant does not check on Corey, or we can see here, he doesn't even hold the door for him when they're leaving. Before this, you can see in the video that when Corey gets off of the treadmill, he wobbles. The defendant continues to mistreat Corey even when leaving the clubhouse. Corey is 6 years old, and you can see where the arrow is, right? He's at the door at this point. What does the defendant do? He turns his back and just continues to walk in the street. Corey just fell 6 times. He's going into a street. He's 6 years old. Is he holding his hand? No. Is he checking on him? No. Is he doing anything to make sure that that little boy is okay? Absolutely not. On March 21st, the next day, defendant's parents see the bruise on Corey's forehead, and this is from the treadmill. Corey tells David Gregor that he fell on the treadmill during a family discussion. On March 22nd, one of Corey's teachers noticed that the bruising was there and sent Corey to the school nurse. His teacher was actually off that day, Kim Peace. She then returns to school on the 23rd. Kim Peace, the teacher who was with Corey every single day of his life while he's in school, observes this injury. And she describes it as, I saw kind of like a burn, not a burn, but it looked like kind of a rug burn on his forehead. Yeah, because he fell off a treadmill. Kim Peace speaks to Corey about this and the injury, and she describes that Corey was quiet and gives one-word responses. Kim Peace is concerned about this, and she speaks to her coworkers about what she saw. On March 23rd, Brianna sees Corey during her visitation at the defendant's apartment in Barnegat, and Brianna sees Corey, and she also sees this bruise on his forehead, and she describes it as being very odd-shaped, and it kind of looked like an imprint of something. Yeah, because it's a treadmill. She also says that he had a bruise on his chest, and it looked like a scrape. She talks about Corey seeming upset and scared. For your consideration, ladies and gentlemen, which is count 1 in the indictment, is endangering the welfare of a child, right, for abuse and neglect. There is no question whatsoever that the defendant is guilty of abuse and neglect of Corey. What do you have to consider for this charge? Number 1, that Corey was a child. He was. Number 2, that the defendant knowingly caused the child harm that would make the child an abused or neglected child. The defendant knew that such conduct would cause the child harm that would make the child an abused or neglected, and that the defendant had a legal duty for the care of the child. Well, it's his father, so he has a legal duty. He knew what he was doing, right, when he put him on the treadmill and punished him. And the judge, during the charge, is going to talk about all these different things which could constitute child endangerment, right? We don't have to prove all of them. We only have to prove one of them. And the state does not have to actually prove a physical injury. Only risk of a physical injury is enough. The infliction of mental suffering or pain, that is enough. One of the sections talks about exposing a child to unnecessary hardship, fatigue, mental or physical strain that may tend to injure the health or physical or moral well-being of that child. And you are going to see when the judge charges you with the law of how many sections of this could apply based upon what is in that video. Not only did the defendant abuse Corey on March 20th, the defendant knowingly inflicted serious bodily injury that ended Corey's life on April 2nd. And ladies and gentlemen, when you have a criminal case, it is like building blocks, right? That's what you do. Each witness testifies, and each witness corroborates one another. And that is how you get to guilty. And there were many witnesses that testified in this case, and each witness testified to a particular part of the case, and when they corroborate each other, and all the evidence that comes into the courtroom from the witness stands, that's how we get to guilty. The video is evidence, and Judge Ryan is going to tell you this, of the defendant's motive, his intent, and or absence of mistake on April 2nd, right? His motive is to punish because he is angry at Corey's mother. His intent is to commit child abuse, to knowingly and purposely inflict serious bodily injury, right, which is the blunt force trauma injuries, which results in Corey's death. Corey didn't die of football injuries or from a football, right? This isn't a mistake. It's not pneumonia. The defendant lacerated Corey's heart, lacerated his liver, and Corey's lungs were bruised. This is why Corey died. Purpose and knowledge, right? these are states of mind. And the judge is going to tell you when he charges you, well, what is that, right? Someone's purpose or their knowledge. This is a condition of a mind. And you're going to hear that this can seldom be seen from a witness, right? The state's never going to be able to put on a witness to say, oh, this is what's in the defendant's mind. So what do you have to do as jurors? You have to make inferences, right, from the conduct. What did the defendant do? What were his words? How did he act? You have to look at the surrounding circumstances, and you have to infer this. And all of the defendant's words and all of his actions show that the defendant knowingly or purposely ended his son's life. Defendant kept Corey out of school on March 26th. Why? Because he was trying to hide Corey. He was trying to hide these bruises, which the state is not saying that the bruises are the cause of his death. It's the blunt force trauma. But what is happening with the bruises is that this is what everybody is seeing. This is what everybody is noticing. This is the catalyst of how we get there. The defendant on his phone searches on the 25th, will red marks turn into bruises? The defendant kept Corey home from school on March 26th, the next day. The defendant did not verify Corey's absence that day. And that is the day that Brianna contacts DCPMP, not the 28th, on the 26th. And this is important because this is when this all starts unraveling for the defendant. And why? Because Corey comes into school and he has a bruise, and now the teachers know. So what does he do? Takes him out of school. Football did not abuse Corey, okay? Corey goes to football tryouts on Saturday, March 27th. Brianna is present. Corey is not injured, right? This is 6-year-old flag football. And after this, Brianna then takes Corey for a visitation at her house until Sunday, March 28th. Ladies and gentlemen, and anybody in this world knows that kids get bruises, right? They can be playing and they get a bruise, right? Children get bruises. This is not the state's argument. Again, bruises are the catalyst. But what they do tell you is what Corey is not telling you. They're telling you what Corey is too afraid to say. Defendant continues hiding Corey by making him a virtual student. On Sunday, March 28th, Brianna sees bruising on Corey, right? And this is because she has him this weekend for part of the time because she takes him home after the flag football. And she sees that he has a large bruise on his chest, and it looked like fingerprint bruises all over his arms and legs. And then she talks about something else on the side of his hip. And when she brings back Corey from visitation, she goes to the Barnegat Township Police Department, right? And we had that testimony of the 2 police officers who came. Then the police do a welfare check at the defendant's apartment. The police see the bruises, and the police talk to Corey, but they don't separate Corey from his father. They call DCPMP. Interesting, though, is while the police are at the house, the defendant doesn't say anything to them about Corey being quarantined or Corey being exposed to COVID. After the police are at his house, the defendant sends this class dojo message to the teacher, Kim Peace. And what he says is, Corey's other side of the family had left the state and saw him this weekend after being at a mass gathering. Brianna learns that Corey is kept out of school. She confronts the defendant about this, and the defendant blocks her on the phone. There was testimony. Corey was not exposed to anyone with COVID, and no one attended a vast gathering or funeral that weekend because the defendant is trying to hide Corey. All this is going on. He tries to do this while it's virtual, but the teacher is still able to see bruises when he's a virtual student. Corey attends school virtually now this week. Kim Peace, his teacher, says she sees bruises on his cheek, and these are not the same ones as March 23rd. Kim Peace talks to the DCP&P worker, and Kim Peace voices her concerns about what is going on. Tuesday, March 30th, Corey is now attending school virtually. Kim Peace says there's still bruising. She speaks to another DCP&P worker, and she says, I don't feel good about what I was seeing and what I was hearing. She's with Corey all the time. Brianna contacts Corey's pediatrician for an emergency appointment to address her concerns on bruising, and she does this on March 30th because all of this is unraveling. And she also speaks to DCP&P about this appointment she's making because she is concerned. March 31st, Corey again attends school virtually. Kim Peace sees the bruising. Brianna files an emergent application for custody because, as she says, she is now in fear of Corey's life. Brianna acts on her concerns, Corey's mother, on Thursday, April 1st of 2021. Brianna picks Corey up about 4:30 and takes him to Dr. Deacon, who is Corey's pediatrician. She then takes Corey to Community Medical Center, and then she then takes Corey to Jersey Shore University Medical Center. Dr. Deacon's testimony corroborates evidence that Corey was murdered, okay? Corey is examined 24 hours before he dies. Dr. Deacon sees 14 areas of bruising and lesions. Corey has no fever. Corey is breathing fine. Corey has no symptoms of pneumonia. Dr. Deacon calls DCP&P. Dr. Deacon calls the emergency room at Community Medical Center so Corey can have blood work. Dr. Deacon did not think it was safe for Corey to go home. That's why she's calling the hospital. Corey tells Dr. Deacon that the injuries are from football and from falling off a treadmill, right? And again, ladies and gentlemen, maybe some of the bruising was sustained of a kid just playing. But we will say that if they are sustained when the defendant is playing football with him, still under his care. Defendant cancels this CPC evaluation because he does not want a specialist to evaluate Corey. Corey had a CPC, right? And there was testimony about this from Child Protective Services and through a witness that had this evaluation on April 2nd, and that the defendant canceled this appointment, and that he would not let Brianna take Corey to the specialist without him. And we know that the defendant received an email with a court order at 4:43 allowing another 7 days for this CPC evaluation. And you can see right here in these text messages where the defendant texts Mark, who had been identified as a DCP&P worker, and he says there, hey, I can't get off work tomorrow. I just asked my manager, so I can go next week. Just let me know the number to schedule. Right? So here, he can't get off work. But if you look at the next text message, hey, so I'm going to take off work tomorrow because Corey's mom decided not to bring him back from visitation, and I'm going to have to go to court tomorrow morning since Natalie isn't working, and who do I reach out to? the defendant can take off work. He can't take off work to have Corey evaluated by a specialist, but he can take off work when he wants to file against Brianna. Because the defendant doesn't care about Corey. He doesn't care about his health. He doesn't care about his safety. He doesn't care about any of those things. The only person he cares about is himself. On 4/1, this court order comes out, and Brianna actually receives the family court order between the time when she was at the pediatrician until she's on her way to community medical center. And there was testimony about this, about what this court order said. And in this court order, it says the court reviewed the letter of investigatory findings, right? And Brianna's request for custody was denied. But it did say that there had to be a CPC evaluation agreed upon by both parties, right? Because at this time, they're both custodial parents of Corey, and there also had to be a pediatrician appointment within 7 days. But Brianna had already taken Corey to the pediatrician, and she had already spoken to DCPMP about this. But what's really interesting about this is that the court did not have the video. The court only reviewed a letter. And Brianna did not receive custody. Corey is taken to community medical center. This is on the advice of Dr. Deacon. Brianna brings Corey to the hospital. Brianna's visitation is almost over when she receives this court order where she's not going to be granted sole custody. Corey is examined. He is absolutely fine. Corey does not have pneumonia. Brianna is given the option to drive Corey and to sign this release. It's noted in the records, and there was testimony about this, that Brianna had to bring Corey home. And she has to bring him home because this court order came out and she was denied her request for custody. Defendant does not want a doctor to examine Corey on April 1st because he does not want Corey talking to doctors without him because he is afraid that Corey is going to tell. And this is what this is all about. The defendant on April 1st, you can see this, exerts pressure on Brianna to leave the hospital, and that is because he does not want Corey to be evaluated. He calls the hospital, he calls police departments, he goes to the Barnegat Police Department. The following morning, he accuses Brianna of kidnapping. The defendant pretends he is clueless as to Corey's mother's whereabouts, but meanwhile, he talks to her. There is a text from the defendant to Brianna at 7:26 on 4/1 while Brianna is at the hospital, right? And before Brianna's visitation time hasn't even ended, right, because she has till 7:30, this is at 7:26. Where are you? It'll be past 7:30 and I will take over and be with my son. I have no idea where you are. She tells him, I'm driving to Jersey Shore Medical Center. I'm doing what a caseworker for DCPMP told me to do. The defendant and Brianna speak that night on the telephone, right? The defendant calls Brianna at 7:27, and we know all of this, right, through Sergeant Coles, because we have all this information from these phones. And we have the call logs. Defendant calls Brianna at 7:27. There is a 37-second conversation. In the meantime, around 8 o'clock, Brianna now is at Jersey Shore University Medical Center. The defendant called Brianna at 8:42, and there is a 1 minute and 12-second conversation. Brianna talked about this in her testimony. She testified about this conversation. She says that the defendant argued with her about being at the hospital and that he wanted her to leave the hospital with Corey. Then after that, what happens is her phone dies for a short period. They were in contact the entire night except for this short time when her phone dies. In response to this, and this says everything, what does the defendant do? He searches Neptune police number at 8:43. He searches the Jersey Shore hospital. He calls Jersey Shore at 8:43, has a 38-second conversation. He calls the hospital at 8:44, has a 5-minute and 36-minute conversation. He calls the Neptune police, right? Because that's where the hospital is located, so he's calling the police over there too. 10-minute and 14-second conversation. He calls Jersey Shore, talks to the hospital for 12 minutes. Then he texts this girl, Marcy, who we met on the internet, who we actually never met in person at this point, and says, at police station now, and we have that text message. Why? Because he goes to the Barnegat Police Department. He calls the Barnegat Police Department. He texts Laura, who we heard testimony is now his girlfriend, and she says to Laura, this other girl, 2 hours late and she's not responding. Oh, really? Because there's text messages and you just talked on the phone. Defendant calls Neptune, 7-minute and 12-second conversation. The defendant speaks to the DCPMP worker, 1 minute and 18 seconds. He texts another girl named Amy, 10-minute at 10:17. The defendant calls the Stafford Police Department at 10:51, and there's a 6-minute and 8-second conversation. Why is the defendant doing this? Because he is afraid that Corey is going to tell. He is afraid of what the doctors are going to see. The defendant knows where Corey is and why. Brianna tells him, the defendant tells others. There's a text message that defendant texts Marcy at 7:48, and where he says to her, she has him at the hospital getting blood work, not going to be back for a while. The defendant speaks to Mark from DCPMP numerous times, 4:26, 5:26, 7:24, and 10:06 p.m. The defendant spoke to the correct hospital where Corey and Brianna are, and the defendant spoke to the police department where the hospital is located, because he knows exactly where she is. Defendant deflects and he gaslights Brianna. This is what he does. And he tries to discredit her, manipulating people and the situation, because he does not want anyone to see the real Christopher Gregor. The only person that has abused Corey is his father. And we know this because it's captured on a Treadmill video. Defendant is not worried about Corey being with Brianna, all right? The defendant doesn't care about Corey's health. He doesn't care about his safety. The defendant cares about preventing Corey from disclosing. That night, when the defendant realized that he could not stop Brianna from leaving the hospital, he could not stop him from being evaluated, what does he do? He doesn't wait up for Corey to come home. Doesn't care. I mean, your son is being evaluated at the hospital, right? If you really cared, you would have stayed up to see what's happening. But he doesn't do that. He goes to sleep. He then starts the next day filing his emergency application. Why? Because he's got to get in front of this, because he doesn't know what Corey said. The defendant does not care about Corey. He cares about controlling the narrative. At 11:43, the defendant says, "Why are you ignoring me?" to Brianna. And she explains to him, and this is later that night on the 1st, "My phone died and I just got a charger. I am at the hospital because DCPMP spoke to doctors and they told me to come here. You could have come here from the beginning. You said, no, drop him off. We could have taken turns the whole time. I'm not doing anything wrong. Stay up and I'll drop him off soon as we're done." She writes, "You're not going to stay awake." At 12:48 a.m., she writes, "How are you going to go to court and say anything about me keeping him? You won't even stay up for me to drop him off. I'm offering right now. Defendant just doesn't respond. The next message is not until 6 a.m. the next day. Brianna had to take Corey back because she has to comply with the court order. The state submits that Dr. Ong corroborates evidence that Corey was murdered. Dr. Ong is a pediatric emergency room doctor at Jersey Shore. He sees Corey less than 24 hours before Corey dies. Corey is admitted to the emergency room, not the hospital, just the emergency room at 9 p.m. Corey was afraid to answer Dr. Ong's questions. He is described as scared. He does a head-to-toe examination. His chest exam is normal. He is not in respiratory distress. He is not wheezing. There's no murmurs. There's no hypoxia. There is absolutely nothing wrong with Corey. His lungs were clear. The doctor maps all of these bruises, and he describes bruises and abrasions and bleeding under the skin. Corey is examined 3 times before he leaves Jersey Shore. There is a skeletal survey that is done, and the doctor explained this. There's 19 radiographs, right? What are these? These are x-rays. Corey gets a chest x-ray done that night, and the doctor tells you that there's no infiltration noted in his lungs, right? So Dr. Ong is not just taking Corey's word for it or his mother's word for it. He orders these tests. He also speaks to DCP&P, and Corey is released home with his mother a little after 1 a.m. on 4/2. The discharge instructions from Dr. Ong, and he testified about this, is that Corey was supposed to follow up with a child abuse specialist who was not at the hospital that night. And why? Because it was Easter weekend and he wasn't available. His oxygen and blood pressure were normal. He was negative for SARS. He was negative for COVID. You know, the reason he was kept out of school for virtual. He was negative for flu A, B, and RSV. Dr. Ong did not see the bruise chart, right, which was done by the pediatrician. This is his own assessment as to what he saw. And there's no sign of infection, because what Dr. Ong does is he also orders his own blood work or lab work. And Corey's white blood cell count is not elevated whatsoever. And there's absolutely no sign of infection. The evidence shows that there was nothing wrong with Corey when he was returned to the defendant at 9 a.m. on April 2nd, 8 hours before he died. Corey was released after 1 a.m. from the hospital. Brianna drove from Neptune to Englishtown after the defendant did not respond to her that night. Brianna and Corey slept together in the basement. Brianna was with Corey. There was no evidence that Corey had a fever, was sick, or injured other than the bruising. What do we know? We know that morning that he ate breakfast. We know that Corey played on Brianna's phone during the car ride. We know that Corey was talking without coughing or straining, right? This accidental recording, right, that happened is right then, in the morning when Brianna is dropping off Corey. And the defense attorney in his argument is making this argument that there's a noise heard. What you hear is Brianna sighing because she thinks that the defendant isn't home because she doesn't see his car. We know that Corey was able to walk and also climb the stairs to get into that apartment. There was nothing wrong with Corey. The defendant inflicted serious bodily injury resulting in his death, and it was blunt force trauma. This is the defendant's final act of child abuse on April 2nd between 9 a.m., and 1:03 p.m. The defendant was the only person who was with his son when these injuries were inflicted. Corey did not die of an infection. He died as a result of this trauma. His heart was lacerated, his liver was lacerated, his liver was bruised, and also his lung was bruised as well. When Corey was brought to the hospital, right, his body is already shutting down due to the blunt force trauma. This is what results in cardiac arrest, seizure, then death. Corey died of blunt impact injury of the chest with laceration of the heart, contusion of the left lung, a laceration and contusion of the liver, and this was a traumatic cause. And that was the testimony of the forensic pathologist, right? Dr. Andrews' testimony proves that the defendant murdered his son Corey. The cause of the death, as per the pathologist, was a lethal train of events, and without which death would not have occurred. Meaning, like, there's no natural cause for this death. He didn't inflict it upon himself. It's blunt force trauma. It's a strike, a hit. That's what blunt force trauma is. He also talks about the pattern, distribution, and varying ages of bruises indicative of child mistreatment. And Corey had contusions over a wide area of his body of varying ages, from under his chin, his head, his trunk, his extremities. And this is where we get back to this bruising again. It's not that a kid has a bruise, so all of a sudden, oh, it's child abuse. That's not what anyone is saying. It is the pattern of bruising. It is the amount of bruising. It is where the bruises are located. And this is what Dr. Andrew is talking about. He observes deep contusions that did not correlate with contusions on the skin, right? So that would be contusions underneath your skin. And he was able to see this in the slides and with the autopsy photos. The bruise near Corey's shoulder blade is not typical from a child running and playing. The bruise on Corey's chest was in a very odd place, unless there was a good explanation for it, right? The doctor talks about Corey's cause and manner of death. Dr. Ragasa performed the autopsy on April 3rd of 2021. Dr. Ragasa concluded that the death was undetermined. He did not conclude that this was from natural causes. The state sought the opinion of Dr. Andrew in February of 2022. And it's not to say that Dr. Ragasa's autopsy, right, what he did in the autopsy is the issue, but is the interpretation of his findings. Dr. Andrew is a former pediatrician, and he's also a forensic pathologist, right? And the defendant is now placed under arrest on March 9th of 2022. Then Dr. Ragasa amends his report in August of 2022. This case was also reviewed by Dr. Falzone, who is the chief medical examiner for New Jersey prior to this being amended. And yes, ladies and gentlemen, the prosecutor's office contacted the doctor. There is a 6-year-old who has passed away, and Dr. Ragasa, in the report which was testified to, talks about a laceration to this child's heart. And yes, we wanted to see what happened to the 6-year-old. Dr. Andrew talks about Corey's lungs. There is a large left lung contusion, and this is not pneumonia. So there was some testimony about this the other day that there was noted in the autopsy report that there was just congestion in the lungs. Dr. Andrews tells you that this is a lung contusion. It's a lung bruise. He also talks about post-mortem CT scans and how they are not reliable. Here, this was read by a clinical radiologist at the hospital, and he tells you that it takes special training to interpret the results of post-mortem CTs because they don't look the same in dead people as they do in living people. It's not that radiologists can interpret CT scans, it's that it's a post-mortem scan. Dr. Andrew talks about Corey's heart and the injury. He tells us that he had a visible contusion on the outside of the heart. The internal examination of Corey's heart shows a laceration or tear in the tissue near the apex of the heart on the inside wall of the heart, right? So what does that mean? This injury was located in the inside of Corey's heart, right? It has to get cut open the heart to even find this injury. It's inside. And he talks about this being a tear of partial thickness, right? So what did he say during his testimony? This tear or this laceration, it didn't pierce all the way through the heart. That's why he's saying that Corey did not die immediately, right? Because it's not a hole. And he also tells us that the laceration and tear, it's not a matter of size, it's a matter of where that is located and what it's doing, right? There's one on the left ventricle and lower left chamber of the heart, all right? And Corey's heart could compensate for several hours because it didn't pierce all the way through. And he also told us that Corey did not bleed out from these injuries. And this wasn't an instant death. And he tells us that this is trauma, and what happens is your heart tries to compensate, and then ultimately your heart decompensates, and then what happens is you go into cardiac arrest. And that's why Corey went into cardiac arrest. He also talks about stress cardiomyopathy in Corey's heart. And ladies and gentlemen, what he's saying is that there's this marker that Corey is suffering ongoing stress. Look what's happened to him. Dr. Andrew also talks about Corey's liver, and there's 2 injuries which are located on the liver, right? There's a laceration or tear in the liver tissue on the right edge, the right lateral aspect of the liver, right? And he talks about the photos clearly show that there's also a contusion that goes fairly deeply into the liver tissue itself. And under the microscope, this was not a super fresh injury. So this is not an injury that could be attributed to CPR. Why? It's not a fresh injury. And he describes this as being an ugly injury, but this was not life-threatening. This is not what killed Corey. And he talks about there was a contusion or bleeding underneath the capsule of the liver on the front edge of the liver. So what he's talking about are 2 separate injuries, okay? But Corey's liver is lacerated on his lateral side, the lateral side of the liver. This is not caused by CPR. It's the lateral side of his liver. That's where the laceration is. Dr. Andrew also talks about Corey's scalp. And he says that when looked at the skin underneath the skin, there was a contusion on the top of his head and a couple of contusions on the backside of the scalp that you couldn't see on the surface. And this is what I was referring to before regarding the bite on Corey's head. The injuries in Corey's condition provide the timeline from when the defendant inflicted blunt force trauma injury on his son. Dr. Andrew is able to determine that these blunt force trauma injuries were inflicted on Corey between 9 a.m. and 1. And what he does is he reviews slides, which are tissue samples, right, which they take from the autopsy, and he observes an inflammatory response with the inflammatory cells, which are located in Corey's heart and liver. And this inflammatory process involves the appearance of certain repair cells to the area of injury, which results in a predictable time frame. So this is this inflammatory process, and it's a well-established. So the laceration to Corey's heart and liver occurred roughly at the same time, and that's what he says. The injuries that Dr. Andrew notes are more indicative that Corey is struck or hit multiple times than that these injuries were somehow caused by CPR. Dr. Andrew tells us that given the age of these injuries is entirely incompatible with them being produced by CPR, because they wouldn't have had this inflammatory response that takes hours to develop, right? And he also talks about CPR on the right side of the chest. CPR is done on the front of the chest. And like I said, the anterior liver injuries are not uncommonly seen with CPR, but not an injury on the side of the liver that goes deep into the tissue. So that's what he's talking about. This lateral injury, which is a deep tissue liver injury, it just simply can't be caused by CPR unless you're doing liver CPR to bring back breathing. In the context of discussing the CPR injury, the doctor tells us that he has never seen a heart or internal laceration of the heart like this in regard to CPR-related injuries, right? So again, it is the fact that this laceration is found deep inside of the heart. And he talks about this inflammation process as well. So the location of the heart and liver injuries are more indicative of the defendant striking Corey more than once, right? And this is something that you have to use your common sense about, right? They're happening at the same time. It's likely more than one thing. Because how is it possible to have an injury to your heart and to your liver on the backside? Certainly not possible to occur with CPR that happens in the middle of your chest. Corey did not have an infection, and we know this from Dr. Feingold. She is a practicing doctor specializing in pediatric infectious disease. She is board certified in her specialty. She actively works in a hospital, a trauma center, and teaches medical students, and she has all the technology available to her. And she reviewed numerous pages of discovery, and she tells us that she didn't see anything that suggested infection. And when asked if her opinion was to a degree of medical certainty, she responded, absolutely. Corey did not have any signs of infection leading up to his death. IV pediatrics, there was no evidence of any kind of infectious process. Community medical center, he had no signs of infection. Jersey Shore, he had a normal white count, no respiratory viral infection, and he had no evidence of having an infection per the doctor. He ate breakfast, he was speaking without coughing, there was no wheezing or shortness of breath, walking and climbing stairs. At Soch, when he arrived, he was not in respiratory distress. There was no retractions, there was no wheezing, no crackles. There was nothing observed to suggest a lung infection. Any shortness of breath was because he was less than 1.5 hours from his death. So this is what the doctor is talking about, not his breathing being off because of some type of infection, but Corey's body was shutting down. He was going to die very, very shortly. She talks about the elevation in white cell count, right? The blood work that was taken at Jersey Shore, there is an elevation in the white blood cells. She's saying this isn't due to an infection. This is because this is what's happening because he's already suffered blunt force trauma injury. His body is shutting down. Of course your white blood cells are going to be elevated at that point. And she talks about this as a cell count consistent with a giant surge. And she also talks about the other level, which is a stress response. Not an infectious response, but a stress response. And this is also consistent with the elevated glucose levels that were determined in this blood work because his body was shutting down due to the blunt force injury and due to this inflammatory reaction that Dr. Andrew was able to find under the microscope, right? And this is how you know that the injuries were not caused by CPR, right? Because if they were caused by CPR, then that would have been after death. So why would there be any inflammatory process there? It is not caused by CPR. Again, factors that do not support infection. There's no bacteria in Corey's bloodstream, which this factor is not even mentioned by Dr. Bodden in his report. The scan of the lungs is a post-mortem CT scan, right? And Dr. Feingold and Dr. Andrews corroborate each other with their testimony. Post-mortem CT scans are not used in the diagnosis of pneumonia because the lungs are no longer holding air. So it's not that the use of the CT scan is wrong, right? But if you're going to use the CT scan, your lungs have to get filled back up with air for that to be reliable. And that's what Dr. Feingold was talking about. Why? Because you stop breathing when you pass. And the lungs would have to be inflated or insulated for this to be readable and reliable, right? So Dr. Bodden's testimony about, the infectious disease doctor, and she didn't know the availability or whatever it was, that's not the issue. If you're going to use the scan, you have to inflate the lungs back up so the scan is actually reliable. This post-mortem lung swab, this is also something that is relied upon for this idea of sepsis, okay? In this lung swab, what was grown, the staph, is one of the most common bacteria around. And this is from the infectious disease doctor who treats children with this all the time. And this is not a reliable way to diagnose an infection in the living because there is a high risk of frequent contamination. And that could even be for intubation, right? And we know that Corey was intubated, right? And we also know that Corey was at the hospital and everyone was touching him. There was nurses, there was a doctor. His body is transported by a funeral home. The autopsy is done the next day. And she tells us how highly prevalent the finding would be in children, right? We know this about kids. They sneeze, they cough, they have this stuff everywhere. And this is why her testimony is important. And what she tells us is the normal clinical course of this endopneumonia occurs over the course of days. It doesn't just occur within hours, and it includes a fever, and there's gross abnormalities, which be noted on a chest x-ray, which Corey had, and everything is fine. There would be an abnormal pulmonary exam, and there would be pus, right? And Dr. Bodden said that in his report, there's no indication that there was pus or an abscess on Corey's lungs.
Ms. Lento,
Yeah.
we've been going about an hour and 10 minutes, ladies
Okay.
and gentlemen. So before Ms. Lento transitions to Dr. Bodden, why don't you take a short break, stretch everyone's legs, give the court reporters a break, and then we'll come back out.
All right.
8 p.m. The jury's in the jury room. Anything from counsel outside the presence of the jury?
No, Judge, thank
All
you.
right, so let's try and keep it short, and we'll wait for the jury to knock, but hopefully 10 minutes or less. Thank you.
Please exit.
You want me to take this off? No, leave that. I want to just go down. Here, put the,
We're back on the record. The jury's still in the jury room. Corporal Bennett, did you tell them to knock her?
Yeah. Want me to knock? I thought we just gave them the timeline.
Right, why don't you knock and ask them if they're ready, please?
You guys ready?
Okay,
Not ready. One in the bathroom.
thank you. Perfect, all
All
right.
right.
405.
Turn out.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to continue with the state summation. Ms.
Thank you,
Lento.
Judge. So in regard to Dr. Bodden's testimony, he's not board certified in pediatrics or infectious disease. He's hired by the defense. He did not give an opinion with a medical degree of certainty even. He's talking about percentages of what he thought happened to Corey. And he even gives this kind of strange theory about SIDS, a SIDS theory in an almost 7-year-old child. And Dr. Bodden is basing his entire opinion on a postmortem CT scan, a postmortem lung culture, and Corey's white blood cell count. But again, we talked about this already. This is the blood cell count from when Corey was at Southern Ocean Medical Center, when his body was depleting from the response and the injuries that he had suffered. Dr. Bodden did not consider the facts which were crucial and essential in determining the manner of death. And the doctor acknowledged this during cross-examination when he says that facts, right, or the details, and I'm summarizing right now, right, that is essential when considering manner of death. And that's why when you look at this opinion, it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense, right? Because it's not congruent with the facts of what's going on in this case, right? Because what's happening is it's an attempt to explain away Corey's injuries, right? Corey presents at the hospital because he has blunt force trauma injuries, right? So let's explain this away by saying it's pneumonia. And now we have to try to explain away what the actual injuries are. Oh, so it's CPR. And the state submits to you that this is why this does not make sense, because it's not based in any fact, right? What is presenting, what is going on with Corey? And that's why none of this was considered, which should be considered when you're determining the matter of death. How somebody died, you're not considering the fact that there were bruises on them. You're not considering any of these things when you're determining a matter of death. It just doesn't make sense. And that's because it's an attempt to explain away the injury. This is what I'm speaking about, right? It just doesn't fit. You're trying to put a square peg in a round hole. And if you look at what was actually happening, right, and Corey's lack of symptoms and all of these lack of things, then we know that Corey did not have an infection, he did not have pneumonia, and he certainly did not have sepsis, especially when there was a blood culture. and there's no bacteria even noted in his blood. The fact that this is not pneumonia, right, this is corroborated, as we already discussed, by Dr. Andrew and Dr. Feingold, and by the direct observations of the people who are actually there, right, who are the nurses at the hospital who actually treat Corey. Dr. Andrew tells us there is zero, not one scintilla of evidence of sepsis or any other infectious disease process. 6-year-olds don't just die. They don't die suddenly out of nowhere. And we know what this is. It's a murder. We know how it happened. Blunt force trauma, strike, a hit. We know who did this. The defendant, Corey's father. We know when it happened. It happened between 9 a.m. and 1 p.m. We know where it happened. It happened at the defendant's apartment and under the defendant's care. And we know why it happened, right? And this is what I was talking about in regard to motive and intent and being able to use the treadmill video from the 20th to determine this, right? The defendant was angry at Corey's mother because she took him to the doctor, she took him to the hospital, and Corey was returned home almost 14 hours later. And the defendant believed that Corey had disclosed this abuse. The defendant caused Corey's death or seriously bodily injury resulting in death, and he did so purposely or knowingly, right? And this is what the state has to prove. Part of it, the judge is going to tell you more in regard to murder, right? You're going to see the state does not have to prove this long plan of premeditation, right? The state has to prove that the defendant caused Corey's death or serious bodily injury that then resulted in death and did so purposely or knowingly, right? And what is purposely? A person acts purposely when it is the person's conscious object to cause death or serious bodily injury resulting in death. And what is knowingly? A person acts knowingly when the person is aware that it is practically certain that this conduct will cause death or serious bodily injury resulting in death. It is the state's argument that the defendant knowingly inflicted serious bodily injury which resulted in Corey's death. Child abuse. We know that this was the conscious objective of the defendant because look at the injuries, right? Look at the type of injuries. You know what you're doing, and this is purpose, when you inflict these type of injuries that are so critical and so life-ending, and they're inflicted upon a 6-year-old. And where the injuries were located, and we kind of touched on this before, right? You could determine that it was multiple strikes, you could determine that it's one strike, it doesn't matter. It is the type of injury and common sense, right, of what the defendant did. You can also consider aggravated manslaughter, which is a lesser included charge of murder. And in that particular charge, the state would have to prove, and this is only part of it, the judge is going to give you more, that the defendant caused Corey's death, and the defendant did so recklessly. And the defendant did so under circumstances manifesting an extreme indifference to human life. So absolutely he did this, ladies and gentlemen, right? He caused Corey's death. He did so recklessly. And there was manifest extreme indifference to Corey's life. So of course, right, with the type of injuries. The third thing for your consideration, which would be a lesser included, would be for reckless manslaughter. And again, the judge is going to give you the law regarding this. And basically, the state would have to prove that the defendant caused Corey's death, and he did so recklessly. Of course. The state submits that the defendant's conduct was beyond reckless manslaughter. It is beyond aggravated manslaughter. And again, when we're talking about motive and intent, right? On March 20th, Brianna was 2 hours late when she dropped off the defendant, and he was punished on the treadmill. On April 2nd, you know what the defendant's motive, his intent. We know that this wasn't an absence or mistake. Corey was 14 hours late, and his mom had him at the hospital all night. The injuries to Corey, and we talked about this already, were on two separate parts of his body. How he behaved at the hospital and when he fled, the kind of things and the amount of things that he deleted from his phone, his searches, even his garbage pail and his flight, this all shows that he killed Corey. The defendant's actions before and after Corey's death prove murder. The text messages on the morning of April 2nd show that he was angry and trying to get ahead of things because he does not know what happened at the hospital the night before. And he says, I'm going to court because you decided to go when you had 7 days last night, and by your text, you were still there at 12:50 at night. You are a detriment to Corey's health, and I will be going to court today about it. He sends that to Brianna at 6:46 a.m. that morning. By the way, school starts at 8:30, so have him back before 8:30, right? He sends this text to Brianna at 6:46 already that morning on the 2nd. Interesting, there is no school on April 2nd. He sends her a text message that morning on the 2nd at 8:37 in the morning where he says, I mean, considering you did kidnap my son for an entire day and night, the minimum that is happening is an entire day and night is going to be removed from your next visit maximum. Hopefully, the courts will agree with my application this morning and you will lose all rights. Well, I don't see anything in the court orders that we talked about that the defendant gets to be the dictator of custody times and all of these things. But the point of this is that at 8:37 in the morning, he is already fired up about this. The defendant tells people that Corey is fine. 8:56, text to Marcy. He confirms, yeah, Corey's fine after he's dropped off. And then he texts Amy, he's home, but I still applied for an emergent application to remove any visitation moving forward. Right? Good. Did she say why she kept him? Right? This is Amy now. Nope. Really? Because it's not correct. He knew exactly where Brianna was. Then to Amy to the defendant, he's okay, right? Yeah. Certainly not someone who is infected with hyperspeed pneumonia, causing their death. Defendant is furious and argues with Brianna, but does not say that anything is wrong with Corey. There's another text message conversation where she says to him, stop being so cocky. And ultimately, at the end of this conversation, the defendant says shows how much evidence there is, doesn't it? You going to be in for a rude awakening today. And this shows you exactly what was going on in the defendant's mind. And cell phones today, right? Text message, searches, all of these things. They are screenshots into someone's mind of what they are doing. The defendant's call to the child abuse hotline at 10:04 a.m. proves that the defendant murdered Corey, right? And this is a significant thing, this call, because there is a lot in there, right? Defendant's words and what he really says. In this call, and there was a transcript, he says he's unsure where Brianna lives. Really? He has no idea where she lives? There was thousands of messages between them. He also says that there's no phone number readily available. He's actually actively texting with Brianna when he's making this phone call, and there was testimony that there was about 800 messages between the two of them. It's also confirmed about the worker saying that there had to be 7 days for the evaluation, right? And what's the reality of the evaluation? Well, the defendant had already canceled that, right? And what he says is that Corey's mother was radio silent from 7:30 until 1 a.m. Well, we know that that's not true. We know about the phone call and the text messages. Defendant's call, as we continue, the defendant's words are that Brianna would not leave Corey's side. Yeah. Because she thinks that Corey is being abused. And then he talks about not being there for his son, and he talks about Corey came home and told me, and the fact that he is so worried. And the reason that he wants to be there for his son is not because he cares about Corey, it's because he doesn't want him evaluated and he doesn't want him talking. And this is the most interesting part of this call. And this is what he says. Now, after she had him for an extended period of time yesterday and had him at the hospital and was coaching him to say that I hit him, he said it. So my big concern is just, that her coaching is going to be disregarded, and it's only going to be regarded as him and his statement. So who is he referring to? He's talking about Corey. And what does this show? It shows you that on that morning, the defendant believed that Corey had made a disclosure. But what is even more interesting about it is look at the word he uses. He uses the word hit. Corey never said that he was hit by his father. You heard the pediatrician is that he fell off the treadmill. And this is precisely where the defendant slips up in this call. Because when Corey got home that morning on the 2nd, he inflicted blunt trauma injuries and he hit him. We know what his motivations are. We know what his intent was. Why is he using that word? And this follows with the fact that this is what the defendant does. He diffuses, he deflects, he distracts, right? And he then in this call starts going after Brianna. And why is he doing this, right? We know that he's already abused Corey on this treadmill, right? You have to keep this in mind. This is all after that. So what is he saying in this call? he's talking about, oh, I'm concerned that she's relapsing and she's erratic and there's no rationale behind it. But then he says, well, there's no specific evidence in that regard. Why? Because he has to place blame on Corey's mother, because this is how he continues to effectuate his abuse. He then begins to attack her family, and then he's talking about coaching. Coached. Know what happened to Corey. This is what he's calling and saying after the treadmill. Corey never disclosed, and I said this before, that he was hit. He said he fell from the treadmill. The defendant is the only person who ever uses the word hit. And that's because he hit. The call to the hotline is evidence of murder, not pneumonia in sepsis. Corey wasn't sick. There's no report of Corey acting loopy when he got home. There's no report of pneumonia 6 hours before going to the hospital and 7 hours before death. There's a confirmation that there is no suspected COVID, right, on this call. There is a confirmation on this call that there are no respiratory infections, coughs, sore throat, or anything like that. Think about this, ladies and gentlemen, right? If Corey would have been returned sick or injured or any of these things, right, he would have been blowing up this screener and DCP complaining about Corey's mother. He would have been telling anybody who would listen about this. That's because Corey is fine. He would have been texting everybody. He would have been telling everybody this. Defendant's actions after the hotline call until Corey goes to the hospital corroborate that the defendant inflicted fatal injuries to Corey that morning, right? The defendant begins texting with Marcy early that morning, and the two have never met in person, but according to the text, the two are going to meet for the first time at the defendant's apartment that night. These texts, what they demonstrate is a total lack of disregard for Corey, right? They demonstrate that Corey does not have a pneumonia because it's the same thing, right? If there would have been anything wrong with Corey, he would have been texting away, oh, she did this, she did that, because Corey is fine. Defendant would not miss an opportunity to blame Corey's mother or complain. Corey is fine. Defendant's actions after the hotline call corroborate, right? Defendant texts Marcy at 11:53, right? Oh, since I took off from work, my son is sleeping, right? The next text, 12 o'clock, nice. I might take a nap so I don't fall asleep at 10 p.m. on you, LOL. 12:14, do you desire a traditional pizza? It's talking about pizza. 12:19, I am actually really excited to see you. 12:23, there's a photo of pizza and there's more talk about pizza. 12:51, you play chess. 1:01, well, just let me know when is the earliest that you can come. 1:46, I'll be able to set it up. I'm super excited after destroying you and party. He's talking about a video game, okay? If Corey was symptomatic and dying of pneumonia, would this be his text messages? Of course not. And I know that is hard to conceive how somebody could act like this, right? But at 2:06 p.m., right, the defendant sends this selfie picture, okay? The defendant is smiling, right? And there's this ordering of McDonald's. And it was most interesting about this picture, Corey does not look good in the picture, but look, ladies and gentlemen, Corey is not wearing a shirt in the picture. okay? And what does that tell you? He went that day with the clothes his mother sent him in, which was a sweatshirt and jeans and underwear. And Corey's mother identified this underwear, right? And where is that found? It is found in this garbage pail when this was delayered. So we know by this picture, right, what is the significance of this? Corey does not look well. He has a blanket up. All his bruising would be covered, or anything would be covered. But we know that not only was the injury inflicted before 206, but we also know that Corey was having symptoms before 206. The facts of the case corroborate Dr. Andrews' findings. And this is what I was talking about in terms of the layering of this garbage can, right? And you can see that the soiled clothes are in there, because the murder occurred before 206, right? And Corey is not wearing a shirt, and we know that Brianna had sent him in those clothes, which were clean. The clothes are under the McDonald's bag. That means that the defendant took Corey's dirty clothes off before 2 p.m., and it's consistent with Dr. Andrew. The defendant's actions after his selfie corroborate that the defendant murdered Corey. At 2:06, right? Don't think I'm moving. 2:13, want to talk on the phone? This is after the picture, right? And I understand, ladies and gentlemen, it's hard to fathom that someone could have such a lack of disregard for this child. At 3:08:37, the defendant searches and later deletes loss of consciousness, sleepy, and nauseous. This was at 3:08. The defendant did not delete all of his searches. He deleted specific searches. At 3:22, right, 26 minutes before arriving at the hospital, the defendant sends a text message to Marcy where he says, "I'm so excited, ha ha." Even after the defendant takes Corey to the hospital, he is still texting Marcy about their plans, right? He's texting her the whole time, because he does not care about Corey. He doesn't care about his health. He doesn't care about anything. And he left that kid while he was there, not checking him in his apartment, while Corey was passing from the injuries, and then he takes him to the hospital. By 3:08, Corey has lost consciousness, yet he's not brought to the hospital until 3:48. That is the time that he is brought to the hospital. And despite Corey losing consciousness, which is deleted from his phone, the search, he does not call 911. Well, what does that show? This child is in this critical condition, and you don't call 911, and you don't call an ambulance. You know why? Two different things. He didn't want anyone inside his apartment. He just didn't care about Corey. No life-saving measures. He only goes to the hospital after a 13-minute phone call with his mother, right? And this is why he goes to the hospital. He goes to the hospital because he talks to his mother. He goes to the hospital because he doesn't want Corey to die in his house. He doesn't care about Corey. The only person he cares about is himself. He tells Brianna that Corey is lethargic, his legs are hurting, sleeping all day, throwing up, and he just didn't feel good and asked her to send the insurance card. But he does not say anything to anyone else about being wrong with Corey and the other people that he was communicating with. And at this point in time, ladies and gentlemen, this is at 3:30 in the afternoon. And yeah, all these things are happening. Because Corey is suffering in that house. He does not tell Corey's mother which hospital he is taking Corey to. Because the defendant knows that if anyone else speaks to these doctors, that all of this is going to be a problem for him. And instead of taking Corey and calling an ambulance and exercising any type of care for this child, he puts him in the back seat of his car. Corey is in critical condition when he arrives at that hospital. He's not being treated by 911. He's just in the back seat of the car. And that's the back seat of the car, right? With the towels, and that's what he did. Driving to the hospital, and you can see him here, gets to the emergency room. Oh, it's going to take him out of the back seat. And you can see Corey's condition. You can see his legs. You can see in this particular video the condition of Corey, right? And how he has no strength left, and he's holding on to his father, and his legs are dangling. And as you continue on in this video, you can actually see the part of it where Corey's head goes back. And this is what Nurse Doyle is talking about in terms of the agonal breathing. Corey arrives at the hospital presenting with trauma at 3:48 p.m. Corey cannot exit the car or walk, doesn't call 911. Defendant does not make a scene or convey any type of urgency as he casually walks into the desk holding his then limp son, who is less than an hour and a half from his death. And that's what the nurses are talking about, right? Think about it. Any parent, any person, if your child was that sick, you'd be yelling, you'd be screaming, you would be in some type of panic. And that is what the nurses are describing at the hospital. Nurse Doyle tells us that he observes Corey, he is pale, he is lethargic, he is stuporous, he is nonverbal, and agonal breathing, which he describes as death breaths, right? He's taking his last breaths. The defendant provides a clinical description of what is happening to Corey. And again, this is what the nurses are talking about, right? Earlier in the day, around 9 o'clock, he says he's dropped off by his mother. Oh, then he was at Jersey Shore the night before. He had a workup and was discharged. Early that morning, he appeared loopy and drowsy. And there's nothing to note whatsoever to indicate that the defendant actually made any of these observations, right? And the point, ladies and gentlemen, is that he is not acting like a concerned or caring father in any regard. And you can see that in his demeanor, his calmness, right? With a limp child hanging off of you, of how he's acting. Defendant makes excuses and deflects in the emergency room before Corey dies. He's admitted at 3:53. Nurse Doyle is still present, but Corey is mainly cared for Nurse Carnevale. And when Corey is brought to the room, she describes the defendant as emotionless. She's not talking about the outside. She's talking about when he is inside room 6, when the defendant is talking about the case history, what symptoms what's happening to Corey. And she is describing this as emotionless, and Doyle describes this as clinical. Because you know why? Parents, or anybody, if this was the condition as your child, you wouldn't be able to calmly walk in and say, oh, he's having symptoms. No. That is inconsistent with any type of behavior of a parent or anyone in regard to any person. Defendant now, at this point, right, this is the condition of Corey, he starts talking about Brianna, right? Because what is he doing? He's already here, going to the hospital with a purpose, with the purpose to deflect and to distract, right? And the defendant doesn't allow the nurse to even call Brianna. No, don't call his mother. Oh, she's a drug addict. What does that have to do with anything at this moment? The defendant says that Corey vomited. He complained of leg pain before he brought him to the ER. Defendant tells nobody at the hospital that Corey defecated his pants, right? That shouldn't be an important thing to talk about, but yet he can talk about Brianna, Corey's mother, in this calm state. He didn't tell anybody at the hospital that there was a loss of consciousness. That didn't apparently matter. In his calm state while this is happening to his son. He's basically providing unassuming symptoms, right? And criticism of Brianna at the time when the actual facts, the actual symptoms would have mattered most. That's not what this is about for him. Corey is pronounced at 5:03, and the defendant is not at his bedside, right? Pediatric CPR was administered, right? And we heard Nurse Carnival talk about it. One-handed pediatric CPR because he was 6 years old. Corey codes and he seizes, right? And what happens is, and this is in the testimony, right? He codes and seizes, and then they're able to get pulses back. Then they get him to the CT scan, right? Because they get pulses back, right? So this is this whole thing with CPR. It's not a continuous act of CPR. They get pulses back, and they try to bring him to get the scan. And Corey codes again. If you see this video, right, where the defendant is now outside of the room, the defendant does not have a breakdown due to grief. He has a breakdown because now he knows that he is going to be on the hook for what happened. He is at the bedside at 4:51 for a matter of minutes, and then he chooses to leave, right? In this video that the defense showed you, if you actually watch the video, you can see at one point where there's like the nurse is pulling on him, like, come back, because he just wants to get out of there. His only tears were for himself because what he did. Instead of staying with his son, he flees. Medical staff stayed in room 6 with Corey. The defendant did not. Brianna calls the defendant right before and after Corey dies. Doesn't answer. The defendant goes back to the waiting room, and what does he do? He calls his parents. At 5:10, David Gregor called the police and told the defendant that he was going to call the police. After hearing this, the defendant leaves the hospital. He goes out the nearest door, right? Not the door that he came into, because you could see him walking in the video. And he casually gets in his car and drives away at 5:20 without any hesitation, upright, phone in hand. Your son just passed away. And this is the most important part of this case, right? If your son had just passed away and you did not know why, right? Oh, this was an infection. This was sepsis. If you had no idea, the last thing you would ever do is leave, right? You would be at that hospital demanding answers. What happened to my son? You would be screaming and yelling. But you know what? The defendant didn't have to do that because you know why? He already had the answers because he knew what he did, right? If he thought Brianna had anything to do with it, he would have been calling and screaming at her, what did you do to my son? He does none of this because he already had the answers, right? Because that is not how any normal human being would act in those circumstances when a 6-year-old son just passes away and you don't know why. You would stay there as long as you possibly can. You would do anything to find answers. The defendant is gone before his parents arrive, and his parents have to clean up the mess. The defendant does not search for answers, and no one at the hospital talks about a GI bleed. And you can see him right there when he's leaving the hospital. Oh, yeah, my 6-year-old just died. So that's what a father does, ladies and gentlemen. He's able to drive. He's able to talk on the phone. The defendant fled because he knew what he did. The defendant was the last person with Corey. He knew that he was going to be investigated, and he knew what he did. So he gave himself distance and time. The defendant put hundreds of miles and multiple states between him and what he knowingly did to Corey. A Barnegat sergeant calls the defendant at 5:24. He rejects the phone call. At 5:25, there's a missed call. At 6:10, he states, can your phone be tracked in airplane mode? And can my car be tracked? This is what he's searching after his 6-year-old son dies. He did not want the police to find his car, his phone, or him. This is not because he is concerned about Corey. He's concerned about himself. The defendant then puts his phone in airplane mode from 6:31 p.m. on April 2nd, right after he's searching, can you be tracked, puts his phone in airplane mode, and doesn't even put it on again until the next day, April 3rd at 2:19 p.m. He then turns his phone back on. And when he turns the phone back on, where is he? He's in Arkansas, near the Texas border. That's how someone acts when their son dies and they don't know how it happened. The defendant's flight is highly corroborative of his guilt. And the judge is also going to talk about consciousness of guilt and give you a charge relating to this, right? He didn't just go to another place in New Jersey or a home of a relative or a friend to say, oh, I'm mourning and this is so terrible. But he travels a substantial distance, and he does this quickly. He's already in that location by that time. How fast is he going? This is not an expression of grief. Okay, and then what continues to happen is a girl comes down, and he meets her at the airport, right? And ultimately, there's testimony from the defendant's father that, hey, that summer, him and his girlfriend are going on the Appalachian Trail, taking a van trip to Maine. He is no longer encumbered by Corey, who is a stranger to him. The defendant only comes back because he is assured by his father. He does not turn around until after he spoke to his father for about 25 minutes And his father tells him, you got to come back. He knows the status of the investigation, and he's not yet been charged. And what does he do? He stops outside of Nashville, of all places. Oh, my son just died. Let me go to Nashville, right? That's a grieving father. And then he picks up Laura, a girl in Tennessee, at the airport, where he's stopped by the members of the Alcoa Police Department, and his car and his phone at that point are taken. So grieving, I'm going to go meet this girl in Tennessee. Said the judge is going to speak to you in the charge about consciousness of guilt, right? And there's deleted and missing texts and about these web searches, right? The loss of consciousness, sleepy and nauseous. This search is from 3:08 on April 2nd. This is deleted after that time and before when his phone is taken while stopped by the Alcoa Police Department after picking up Laura on April 4th. Between the defendant's last communication with Brianna around 3:20 p.m. on April 2nd and when his phone is taken from being stopped with the Alcoa Police Department, the defendant deletes all of his text messages with Brianna. And we have the text messages because there's testimony that Brianna provided us with her phone. And this involved the testimony of Sergeant Coles. There are no individual text messages with either the defendant's mom or dad before April 3rd. The defendant manually deleted things from his phone that were the most damaging to him of what he thought was damaging to him. And arguments with Brianna, discussions, and regarding Corey's treatment or doctor's visits on April 1st. And what parent deletes this after his child passes away? Right? Again, you don't know what happens to Corey, but I'm going to delete my phone. Come on, ladies and gentlemen. Common sense. These deletions are intentional because there's texts from others within this time frame. There's texts with Amy and Laura, and the texts that are there are only the texts that say negative things about Corey's mom. When the defendant is in Arkansas and Tennessee, he searches the internet for alternate facts and explanations for what he did. The defendant knew what he did to Corey and where he hid him, right? So he's trying now to make this fit. Sergeant Coles testifies that these were his searches. What causes a rise in blood sugar and white blood cells? Could internal bleeding raise your blood sugar levels? How does gastrointestinal bleeding happen? Can a GI bleed be slow? There was a murder determined from an autopsy how long to file charge. Okay? This is not rooted in grief. It shows you, again, phones, right? They are like an image into someone's mind. Why is he looking up GI bleeds and all of these things? Because he knew where he hit Corey. That's why he's looking them up. In terms of the investigation, the police speak to David Gregor. Mr. Gregor sees the treadmill video, and he tells us that he's actually the person who took care of Corey, right, and living in Monroe. And this corroborates the fact that the defendant didn't care or really know his son. There was also testimony from Sergeant Scuddy, right, that he had attended the autopsy and that they immediately started their investigation, right, and that's what they do, and that's why we know about the garbage, right, because Sergeant Scuddy didn't go on a wild goose chase and start tearing up this apartment for blood when there's internal injuries, because he goes to the autopsy and he knows that it's internal, and what does he do? He starts looking at the garbage, which is an insight to what was happening on that day. The other sergeant testified about the defendant's car and phone, which were recovered in Alcoa. Ladies and gentlemen, again, based upon the witnesses that have testified, based upon the evidence that was presented in this courtroom, there is no doubt, firmly convinced that the defendant is the only person who did this to his own son. Corey Travis Michello was 6 years old. He was in first grade. He loved the solar system. He was described as being silly and smart. He was murdered by his father, the person who was supposed to protect him and take care of him the most. There's no question what he did to Corey on April 2nd, his final act of child abuse. This case is about Corey. This case is about Corey and how he became the ultimate victim of the defendant's punishment and abuse. 6-year-olds just don't die, and neither did Corey. State thanks you for your time and consideration, myself and Assistant Prosecutor Schroem. Thank you.
Thank you.